Welcome to Newrealities. I'm Alan Steinfeld, and this program is about the evolution of our consciousness. And I feel we're coming into a time where different levels of our humanity are awakening. And tonight's guest is very much a part of that awakening. I'm talking to Tom Kenyon. He's a channel for the Hathors, and he has an understanding, I feel, of this movement of thought, of being, of evolution. That's what I feel you have a really great perspective on, some of the conversations we've had. And you're a channel, and you have a great mind, which I like about you. You're very practical, and yet something's happening to you that seems to almost be unexplainable, inexplicable. Do you have a handle on both those worlds? Like, so you're a rational person in the world, and something else is going on. How do you integrate those two parts of yourself?
Well, I reference my early experience when I was 18. I had a spontaneous samadhi on my uncle's farm.
Right.
And I was a white boy from Virginia living in North Carolina for the summer, and I had no context for this, but I entered a state of consciousness in which the world completely disappeared.
Right.
And I had no thought. I was aware of consciousness, aware of itself, which in the Hindu tradition is called Sat Chitananda.
Yeah.
So that arose spontaneously, and I thought that a very short time had passed, but the sun was very low in the sky when I finally opened my eyes, and these cows had wandered over and were looking at me. And so that pivotal experience drove me to try to find out what happened, because it was so out of context of the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And so I went into the mystical traditions of Christianity and explored St. Francis of Assisi and Meister Eckhart and St. Teresa Avignon and all the various mystics. I was practicing those meditations. And then I went into Eastern philosophy and Taoism and Tibetan Buddhism and the Vedas, and that all came together, but there was still something missing, and what the missing piece for me was neuropsychology. And so when I brought that in, I had an understanding that seems antithetical, but we don't think of mysticism and spirituality as being compatible with science. But there's a place where they nest together, and that's what's interesting.
And they have to nest together because...
I believe so.
No, I think that work is very important for what we're all doing here. How do they fit, the neuropsychology, the mysticism, and the practical understanding of brain psychology?
Well, right now you and I are having a conversation.
Right.
And although we're not hooked up to an EEG machine or an MRI scanner, we know that the language centers in the left side are very active, and those who are watching this are making sense of our language are having similar. There's a lot of activity going on in the left hemisphere.
Right.
The spiritual experiences, there's an activation of the right hemisphere, and other areas of the brain also get involved, but the brain shifts. Literally, it's neurological patterning in these mystical spiritual experiences. So there's a direct relationship between what we perceive and what's going on in the brain. But then for me, there's another layer that's the most interesting, which is the transcendence of brain function. What happens in states of consciousness where, like remote viewing and near-death experiences, where the brain is not taking in information, there's no processing, but in near-death experiences, people report afterwards in detail what people were talking about.
So what do you make of that then?
There is a non-localized aspect of consciousness, and various perennial philosophies talk about it. There's a part of it, we're localized right now. I'm responding to you in this studio in Manhattan. But there's another aspect of you and me and everyone watching that's non-localized, that has access to information beyond our nervous systems. And that's what I find interesting, and use the lens of, ironically, neuropsychology and quantum physics to go beyond those templates.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying, and that's why the those electronic coin tosses where world events seem to work. You know what I'm talking about?
Right.
The Roger Nelson stuff at Princeton, and because we're emanating a field but it's beyond the language we have yet to develop culturally.
Correct, and I agree.
And so what we're trying to formulate, I think, in this new age, and we want to call it that, that's gotten such a bad name, but
bad name for a good reason.
A bad name, but in the new level of consciousness, there's something else that you're mentioning that is going on that needs to be languaged and acknowledged as a valid human experience.
Right.
And we don't have, right now the culture's split between those intellectuals who don't believe anything spiritual is happening.
Correct.
Or the spiritual woo-woos that don't think intellectual science matters. So we're making the bridge.
Right. Well, St. Loyola said that we must have faith without reason. And I disagree. I think we have to have both.
Yeah.
And so for me, those who are in the extremes of the New Age, who are into whatever they are, it could be the crystals have the power, or this latest device created by someone has the power, and they put all their faith in it, and they won't look at anything that questions the methodology or the belief systems. They just won't pay attention. I think that's dangerous. And so that leads into these fanaticism. It's like, I really wonder what happened for those who bought the Mayan end of the world at 2012. What happened on December 22nd when they...
I never bought that.
Well,
That's one thing I didn't buy.
No, but I mean, and this happened before, and historically we know that in the 1st century AD in Europe, there was a strong belief that as the calendar hit the first year, that the world was coming to an end. And many people got up and left their homes and went on pilgrimages because they knew the world was going to come to an end. Well, we're 2,000 years later and they were wrong. So this type of thing rises
It does.
again and again and again.
Because it's based on belief, and we know belief doesn't mean anything. It's just that kind of mental conditioning. But you're in a very curious place because you are accessing a realm of consciousness that some people would equate to that sort of follow blindly faith. And how do you keep a leash or a handle on what's coming to you in your awareness? And I'm just curious about your process. You know what I'm asking? How do you know what's not you, what's coming out of your ego-generated mind, which everyone has, and what transcends that? Is there a way that there's a code or some identification that with the Hathors?
It's a quality of feeling that I identify.
Right.
It's related to a heart vibration that has the characteristic of love and a deep gratitude, but also intelligence simultaneously. So it's not just in a sea of love and gratitude, there's also intelligence about it. So the Hathors are very practical also. So for me, I can accommodate this in that, well, let me tell you a story that happened when I think it explains it beautifully. When in my 20s, I went to see a Swami by the name of Nityananda, and he was a very powerful being. And I was new to this stuff, and I went with a friend of mine, and we drove in my old Ford that I called Big Red, and it had a radio, and we crossed the panhandle of Texas because this guy was in Texas at the edge, in a little small town. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, the radio station would pick up things from Kansas, Canada, New York, California. And it was all this jumble and Bible-toting, hellfire damnation, people selling sex and rock and roll, and it was all these channels were merging, and you'd have to take the tuner because it was an old analog tuner, and kind of to find the exact channel that you wanted to listen to. And I think that's what happens to us as human beings. In our brains, we have the pineal gland, which is a crystalline structure. There's actual crystal structure that the cell biologist Bruce Lipton has mentioned has the capacity to be like an antenna. And I that's my experience as well. So all human beings are receiving information from multiple layers of themselves and the culture and the cosmos. And it's like that 3 o'clock radio, you have to fine tune it. And so for me, the task is how do I accommodate the art of tuning my brain so that I get something that is of value and has truth to it, the signature of truth. And it's an internal brain skill. I believe that every human being is channeling.
We're channeling ourselves. You
Yes.
know, we're channeling
And
whoever
many
it is.
levels of ourselves.
Right, many levels. Right.
So the question can be answered biologically for me through the metaphor of a tree. Many trees have deep tap roots, and that anchors the tree. It's going down deep, 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 deep into the earth. This is the deepest root. Then there are these other roots that are on the surface, just under the surface, that are drawing nutrients. But the taproot anchors the tree. So for me, in that metaphor, we all have taproots that go into our what I call authentic spiritual nature. And then we have these other roots that are closer to the surface that are drawing in from our culture, our religions, our spiritual dogmas, all of our personal experiences. So the tree of our nature has this surface information and personalities, and we also have a taproot. And what my interest in is going to the taproot and authentic spiritual experiences and how that can transform us versus counterfeit.
Right, and I do want to talk about the counterfeit experience because it's all over the place, including religions. But
Oh God, yes.
but no,
Pun not intended.
No. That's funny. But before we get there, I want to know. So this feeling of love comes in, this higher. You know, you feel uplifted when you're meeting with the Hathors, or they're coming through. How do you know that's not an aspect of you, and who are you anyway?
Yes, right.
Tom Kenyon? I mean, you're another frequency, another branch, another root in that, and like me. But when you're removed, that part of the personality is removed, you are accessing another branch.
Yeah.
But how do you know that's not you? I mean, the Hathors, or
Well, I have a long history with them. At the
Oh, right.
beginning, when they first appeared to me when I was having a meditation retreat and just by myself. I was doing Siddhas yoga, and two appeared to me psychically. So we're not talking about physically manifesting, but vividly, psychically there, and I could see them.
you could see. I mean, you didn't think you were crazy though, because other people see things and they are crazy. And
Yes,
And so
but,
how'd
but
you
this
know-
wasn't an hallucination. It was a psychic impression.
you knew it,
Yes.
because a lot of people don't trust that. But anyway, you knew that. You knew it. You psychically
well, by
felt
this
that.
point, I had been involved in brain research for 10 years through acoustic brain research, and I had worked with a lot of researchers, so I had absorbed like a sponge their knowledge, information, so I had some understanding about this interface between psychology and neurology and spirituality. So when they appeared, I recognized it was a clairvoyant experience, not an hallucination, a visual hallucination. And so then, in the course of my many years with them, I tested them constantly.
Yeah,
And
But can I just ask you, how were you so sure it was real? And I believe it was. I'm not doubting that. But how did you know it wasn't a hallucination and there's a substantial awareness in your environment? I mean, how do we know, especially for some people maybe who don't have a strong ego structure, but we'll get into that later. But how did you know?
well, for me, I questioned my sanity.
Okay.
I was working as a psychotherapist, and so first thing went up in the red flag, and I'm having a psychotic experience. Go through the checklist. No, you're not. You're having a clairvoyant experience, which is different than a visual hallucination. Okay, we can let that one go. But still, I questioned. Well, they gave me a body of information they called the geometry of consciousness, which were movements of patterns within the brain that they said would improve brain performance, and they instructed me in it. And I had been working with the brain for 10 years through acoustic brain research, and so I recognized there were changes taking place in my own neurology that were fundamentally profound.
That
and
they helped
effective.
you with this.
They gave me this information. I did not believe who they said they were. So I put them in this box, delusional.
Okay.
And so then I looked at them as archetypes. They have this, they say they're independent of me, but they're not. So then they asked me to, after I went through these 3 exercises for several months, and they said, you recognize that your brain has changed, right? And I said, yes.
They talk to you telepathically. Like
Yes,
that, yeah.
telepathically, nothing, not a visual, not an auditory hallucination.
Right.
And they said, what do you think about it? And I said, well, I think it's very profound, but I'm not sure about affecting other people. And they said, well, if you taught it to other people, they would experience improvements in brain function, performance, and access to other dimensions of consciousness.
Right.
So I said, okay, this is still bullshit, but it's interesting. So
Because
then
you
I
thought
did-
it was coming from you. That's
it, right? I thought it was coming from me.
Well, that's very
So then I formed 3 Beta tests in the state of Washington and went to 3 different cities where people didn't know each other. And I gave a free course where I taught these geometries over the course of 4 weeks.
What do you mean by the geometry? There were certain.
There are 3 exercises they gave me that involved geometry that a person would do inside in a
Incorporating like
meditation.
internal geometry.
Internal geometry, like they would visualize these internal geometries.
Oh, I see.
And there were 3 meditations based on geometry. And so I taught these to these 3 different cities.
Right.
And what was fascinating was everyone experienced radical changes in brain performance, creativity. I will never forget there was a professor of art who was he was the dean of the art school, and he was asked to make a contribution to an exhibit, and he was in absolute terror because he had lost his creative juices and he was in a dead zone. And he took this class and he reported that after doing these exercises, he suddenly was inspired and had his creativity back. And so I'll never forget the last class at the last city when, and somebody said, "This has changed my life.
Wow.
How did you come up with this?"
What did you tell them?
And I said, "The Hathors are a group of beings that,"
funny.
and so I was very
That's funny.
shy about talking about this. And so I went through a whole period where I explained these beings have given this information. I don't know if it's me or them, but here it is, and use it and see what happens. So people's lives were changed for the better. And then I've had other experiences.
Are you still doing these geometries, or is it still
It's in a
some-
book. Now it's in a book called
What-
The Hathor Material.
Oh, okay.
So people can access it.
Okay.
And,
then you had these other experiences with it.
yes, I've had a personal history over many decades now that tell me that they have an external reality to me. I remember I was once in California teaching, and they asked me to write a book.
Right.
And I said, there's no friggin' way I'm going to put my treasured letters that I worked so hard for after my name on a book about you guys who say you're from another
Well, you
universe.
really talk back to them, huh?
Yes, I am irreverent.
That's so funny.
And they have a wonderful sense of humor.
And wh-
So they said, okay. So I went to California a few months later, and a woman came up to me and said, you know, I wish you would write that book the Hathors asked you to write because they keep bothering me in meditation.
Oh, the Hathor's bothering her.
And I'd never met this woman before. And
That's
so,
funny.
yeah, so many, many things. We could take the whole time we have
No.
to talk about the personal history. So I have enough personal history that my skepticism, which I think is important to have when you
Yeah.
enter altered states of consciousness, is in a place of neutrality.
Yeah, no, I believe beings definitely exist beyond us in a non-physical realm, and I believe that the brain, mind, is capable of accessing those realms, and we've really put a limit on what we're capable of as human beings. Psychology has locked us into thinking everything's a manifestation of some psychological projection, and that's really been in the way of our evolution. So I think what you're doing is bridging a cultural gap that needs to be, looked at. But there's the other side too that we talked about, that dark side where people are hallucinating. They
Yes.
are making it up, and
Yes.
and they think it's real. I mean, with your material, it was proven and by people that, yeah, this is functional, this is helpful. But what do you say to those other people? I mean, not that we're here to judge other people, but what do you say? How does someone know the difference? How would you?
That's a good question.
I mean,
Let me ask you a question.
yeah, sure, I'm open.
Out of the files of psychotherapy where I worked with people who were delusional,
Yeah.
which archetype would interest you most to explore for a few moments? Because that will say
Me?
volumes. Either the archetype of King Arthur or the archetype of the Virgin Mary.
You're asking me?
Because there's 2 clients in the past that had delusions. And so I want to answer your question, I want to talk about my encounters with a delusional person.
Oh.
One was operating as Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Actually
And
thinking they were.
She thought.
Okay, maybe
And
she was channeling it.
Yeah, but then we get into the psychosis, and this is the interesting thread.
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
And then the other one is someone who thought he was King Arthur.
Right.
So where should we go? Should we go to the Middle Ages and King Arthur, or should we go back?
Well, let's go to Mary Magdalene, because so many people think they're...
Mea culpa. Mea culpa.
What does that mean?
My mother, my fault, my grievous fault. You're not Catholic, obviously.
No, I'm not.
My mother was Catholic.
Jewish. I was born
And
from
my mother
that.
was Catholic, and so she was named Dolorosa, which means sorrow in Portuguese.
Poor woman. Oh
yeah, I
my
know,
God. That is a thought form to live through.
Yes, it was. So the template is that we're guilty. So mea culpa means my fault, my most grievous fault.
Oh, okay. We have to get over that.
So
one.
we do have to get over that as a culture, and on so many levels. But this
But going
particular
back
client,
to
this client, I got a phone call from an associate in California, and I had worked at his institute. I had co-taught with him, and he called me from California. I was in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. This is when I was doing the brain research. And he said, well, you see a student of mine who had a psychotic break, and she had attended one of his 9-day intensives. Or I think it was a 5-day. He had various levels. I think this was a 5-day intensive, and she had a psychotic break at the end of it. And her husband said that if this wasn't resolved, he was going to sue this guy and his institute. And I said, well, and where do they live? They live in Florida. They're willing to come up to Chapel Hill. And I said, my schedule's really busy, but I can see them over the weekend. And so they came up.
And you had a functioning practice as a psychotherapist there.
Right. So in walks this couple. And so what had happened for her was that she went through this 5-day intensive, which was the use of sound, profound spiritual meditations, and brain-altering technologies.
Okay.
And after 5 days, on the 4th day, she started to experience herself as the Virgin Mary, and no longer, we'll call her Midge.
Okay.
Not her real name.
Okay.
But this actually happened for a real woman.
I'm sure.
On the 5th day, Midge completely disappeared as a reference point. She was the Virgin Mary, Madonna. She was the Madonna. So she's walking through the campus, feeling herself as a Madonna, and emanating this energy that people are responding to.
And she really is. Okay. And she
she
really is emanating that.
Yeah, she is emanating something that's so strong that people are coming up and asking for her blessings. And she's blessing and healing people emotionally. People are sobbing.
So couldn't she have been the embodiment of the Madonna? Okay.
At that moment, I believe she was, but let's get to the two threads that run together, psychosis and authentic spirituality.
Okay, good.
Because this is the territory where the hot spot is.
It is.
So she was truly in a state of bliss and love, agape, divine love, emanating this and feeling nested in this archetype, the divine, loving feminine, which is only one archetype for the feminine, by the way. But she was in this particular one. She goes to the airport in this feeling that she's the Madonna. She's waiting for her plane. She's looking at magazines, and she sees on the front page her name, Madonna. So she buys it. But this is a different Madonna. This is Madonna the rock star. So suddenly, because she had no ego strength, inherent psychologically, and we'll get to why she didn't have that, because it's fascinating in itself.
I think that's really important. You need to have a strong ego in order to do the work you're doing.
Yes, and if you don't, you get spiraled out.
You do. Yeah.
So she is reading about Madonna the rock star and shifts her identity. It's like a revolving door and goes into a different frequency domain, and she's no longer Madonna, the mother of Jesus. She's Madonna the rock star, traveling incognito. She even has her sunglasses.
That's too bad,
on her
even
eyes.
for Madonna. Maybe it's too bad.
Yeah, I know, it's just not.
But okay, so she becomes Madonna.
She's taking her high heel and trying to break the glass at 30,000 feet because there are demons on the wings. She's having physical hallucinations. She sees them. This is one of the signatures of psychosis.
Yeah.
So she's seeing things that aren't there. She's trying to save.
She thinks they're there. I mean, excuse me, just the way you thought there was other beings were there, in a way. I mean, not exactly, but she's seeing that.
She's seeing demons on the wing.
Yeah, but how do we know she's not? I mean, there might be demons.
We don't.
It might actually be demons on the wing.
Might have been.
But she doesn't have any basis in this reality. That was the difference between you and her.
And the context was, you don't take your high heel shoes off and try to break the glass of a plane at 30,000 feet. So the stewards came in, and the stewardesses, they restrained her, and when they landed, she was taken to a mental hospital and given antipsychotic medication. And after a few days, she came out of that because the brain chemistry changed. And she was not perceiving herself as the archetype. She was Midge again, although damaged and
And
fragile.
Yeah.
So she
right.
went home, and then her husband and she comes up to see me.
Uh-huh.
So I go through the history, and one of the things that happened, which she confessed to her husband, and it's the first time he had ever heard of this, was that 10 years earlier, she was in her family, his family, had a furniture store. And she hated it. She hated her family, actually, his family.
Right.
And hated having to work there in the store. And
Right.
one night, she snuck into the store and burned it to the ground.
Ooh, that's not good.
No, on many levels.
No,
Not
she
good.
did that just because she hated it. She didn't. That
She
was
didn't
her
have- She
release.
did not have the psychological strength or the courage to say, I'm not going to do this anymore.
Right.
She took the coward's way and burned that business down.
Okay.
And they didn't rebuild. So she carried this dark secret with her.
And guilt, I'm
and
sure.
guilt,
Yeah.
yes. And that was like a poisonous seed in her psychology, which made her self-identity fragile. So looking back at the whole experience, I think what happened was when she had that moment where she became agape through the feminine archetype of the Virgin Mary,
Yeah.
she was having what I would call an authentic spiritual experience, and she was emanating these energies,
Yeah.
and people were responding and having openings. But then she flipped into another aspect,
Right.
a lower vibratory field,
Right.
and then she became psychotic. And this is, I think, one thing that needs to really be addressed, and I hate the term New Age, but the personal growth movement
Yeah, we'll call it that.
is with gurus
That's part of it.
or anyone who claims to be an authority. And people leverage power and give them their power.
Yeah.
Be clear who you're giving your power to, because a person can operate within a authentic spiritual energy, and I've seen this many times. And then they have a personality quirk that can come in.
I've
and
seen
they can
that
snap.
many times
Yes.
too from this side
Yes.
of the followership.
And it's not pleasant.
It's you have to call people on their stuff
Yes.
and say, like, there's the spiritual teaching and there's the person.
Yes.
But the point you made is this idea of the strong ego base. You know who you are as Tom. I
Right.
mean, you which might be good and bad because no, because you
It's a mixed bag.
no, it's a lovely human person there, but we get attached to the personality structures and they become solidified and stuck and stuck to that, don't allow us our evolution. I mean, I'm just talking about myself, and you have that as a base to access these realms. But how do we, I guess, stay fluid in the ego personality structure, know it's there, and yet be open for you are open for the transcendent experience, but will you ever allow yourself to completely dissolve, I'm not saying you should, and become the Hathors, emanate them, embody...
Well, I have no need to become the Hathors.
Right.
Nor desire to become the
Or that
Hathors.
feeling, I mean, be the emanation of, maybe not the Hathor, but be the emanation of Tom Kenyon in that loving, emanation. I'm not saying you should.
Well, I'm learning to be more myself every day.
Yeah.
But the term the ego structure for me is problematic, because if we think of structure, we think of something that's solid.
Yeah.
It's locked in. I think that the ego is really not that way. It
Okay.
can become that way.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's in its nature to be a structure.
No, you're
What
right. You're right.
It's more of a reference point.
Right.
I know that I'm sitting in this chair
Yeah.
talking to you. If I went into one of these states and I could be aware of other realms, I will still be in touch with me as a reference point.
You have a foot in both
and
worlds.
I can be fluid and move through different realms, but I'm always aware that I'm right here.
I think that's the key right there.
Yes.
That which wasn't the key of the woman trying to
No,
bang on
unfortunately.
the window of the airplane. Or a lot of people that come in and believe they're the emanations of the God, or they're channeling God, or whatever.
Yes.
But it's still a very slippery slope, where you go with, not you, but these people that people call me all the time, I want to be on your show because I'm channeling,
Oh God, yes. Right.
Grandmother Two Feathers or somebody like that. They want to be, and I said, well, I don't know, but
Well, the archetypes are seductive
Yeah.
if you don't have your own life.
Yeah.
Because they're so large, they're larger than life. So one can step into the energy of the archetype and I am Isis, or I am Zeus, or I am whatever, and the power is so strong. So what happens in my experience is some people, when their own personal self-identity is so weak and they don't have enough self-esteem or a solid reference point, they can live the heroic life of the archetype.
Right.
But the problem is they then are not living the life as a human being.
Right. But isn't, and I'm just throwing this out there, our job or mission at this point in our collective evolution is to become the embodiment of the divine emanations, to kind of slowly let go of the personality structures. That's what I think ascension is a word that's thrown about. But I think to embody that divinity is why we're here. But I get the sense, still keep our foot in the real world is what I get the sense of.
In Taoism, they say, before step into heaven, first step on earth.
Right.
So you have to have a solid something firm, because if you go into the higher vibrational fields, this is just my experience, you can fall. Like Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, as a metaphor, the sun being.
So we need a foot in both worlds, but I think we're evolving to a place, maybe, where, not that we're transhuman, but there's the higher ideals will be something that the human psychology won't be pulled back down to. This is what, the pettiness, the wars, or maybe that will always be here. I don't know. I'm hoping we are transcending these lower realms, or you're not getting that.
I think collectively we are in a morphogenetic field that is morphing, transforming into something unknown. And I think its final expression is going to be many expressions. And some of it will be, perhaps more people will be loving, but we're moving through a phase where some people are getting very selfish, and they're, right now, at this moment in time, Islam is being commandeered.
All the fundamentalism.
All the fundamentalists.
Yeah.
But right now, there's ancient sites that are being destroyed.
I know. It's horrible. It's awful.
So that is not an expression of loving and embracing. So I don't personally feel that we are collectively moving to this. It's a potential. It's a possibility. But if I were to put my money down where my mouth speaks, I don't think I would put it there. But I think it's more complex. The human experience and our evolution is more complex than that.
But what do the Hathors say about that? Here they are coming to you, and probably a lot of people, to lift the vibration out of that fundamentalist belief. How do they deal with this or talk about this situation that's going on?
They say that things can change at the 11th hour. At the last minute of the 11th hour, human consciousness can go boom.
It can, but
right, they can. But and it's what their focus is on, the individual, because they say that the seed for the group transformation lies with the individual. So all their messages, for the most part, are about how do you, the collective you, move to a higher vibrational field emotionally, but remains intelligent and practical at the same time.
Right.
And so they keep coming back to appreciation and gratitude as a vibrational field that will increase intelligence and allow one to access higher dimensional information and be more creative. And so interestingly enough, there's research going on, Heart Math Institute has been looking at this, and other researchers are as well, that when we enter a state of appreciation, the magnetic fields, the various fields emanating from the heart go up and affect the brain. So literally our brain physiology, how our brain is putting together neurological networks, is affected by what we are feeling. We know that the limbic part of the brain is where emotions actually originate from, but the heart creates complex electromagnetic fields that affect the brain. And so the research shows that when we enter a state of appreciation, we become more effective and more creative. So that's how the Hathors are talking about.
But we also emanate a field. So our field, I mean, how are we going to stop the fundamentalists? Yeah, we're all evolving, but what about, do they talk about the field effect, in a sense, influencing those fundamentalist radicals? Or
no, they don't.
Well, how are we going to how are we going to stop? I mean, maybe.
We need to call in Ghostbusters.
I guess so.
Who are you going to call?
Maybe that's not.
Ghostbusters.
But no, it is. I understand, but it is a serious, probably the most serious threat out there.
At this moment, it's
there's
very serious.
There's 100,000 refugees flooding into Europe
Yes.
from the Middle East, and there's
Yes.
no place for them to go. I mean,
Right.
what do we do?
And with climate change, it's been predicted because
Yeah.
of the loss of water and agriculture, that's just the first wave. It's going to be a very complex situation. We're just seeing the beginning of it.
Wow.
And so the Hathors say,
Yes.
don't be overwhelmed by what you see externally.
Okay.
Always go back to a place of intelligent living, pragmatism, appreciation, and gratitude. And the more you are in that, that's what they say. I have arguments with them about this.
No,
but this
I
is
like
what they
that.
say since you asked.
I think that's because I can only really work from this place outward. If I
it's
have
true for all of us.
those things, you can argue with the Hathors. I appreciate that, but I like what they're saying about that because their job is to work with each person to evolve their state that will have that 11th hour effect, I think.
Right, and they say that when enough of us shift, the collective will shift. There'll be a collective field effect. So they don't come in, work collectively, they work with information for the individual, but with an eye towards the collective.
Right. So I guess, and do they see a time, maybe it's a possible future, where the Earth lives in peace in a utopia? Do they see that?
Yes, it is a possibility.
But we're right here at the final hour working our way towards that. Or
That's one way of looking at it. But
Yeah.
I personally think that life is much more complex in its evolutionary path than we reach a utopia and everything is wonderful.
Right.
I think there will always be conflicts and there will always be disagreements. There will always be conflicting energies because we live in a dualistic universe. One of the things I do appreciate that the Hathors said, of the many things that I appreciate, is their perspective is, as human beings, we are actually spiritual beings having a human experience.
Right.
And what the value of this life is moving through the difficulties. We cultivate higher qualities in ourselves and we take those with us vibrationally to our different expressions.
And that's
after
our
this life.
evolution.
That's our evolution.
That's what we do each lifetime,
Yes.
hopefully.
And this lifetime is a blink
Right.
in the cosmic flow.